Welcome back to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast, where we will explore the local arts, culture, and community in the Lehigh Valley. We'll be doing this through conversations with individual artists, administrators, and organizations. We'll discuss all types of mediums with the goal of enriching local arts culture.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben. Welcome back to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast. I am joined today by our first guest host, and that's Keith Garuba.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be here, Ben. Thank you so much for inviting me back.
You're very welcome. Thanks for coming on. Tell me a little bit about what you've been up to recently.
Oh, man. I've been having a really fun year. I guess when you had me last as a guest, I was kind of gearing up to get into a couple of shows I had over the summer. And one of those shows was with the International Print Center of New York. And that show came with a special perk for me. I was honored to be offered an artist in residence relationship with them to coincide with that show that was over the summer, their new Prince show. Ben, you have special insight into what I've had going on because you and I
do.
have worked together.
I've been documenting that project for you.
Exactly.
We've been having a good time.
We were having a good time, and I was so thrilled to have you with me. But also, you were a great creative sounding board and brought a great energy to the whole thing. So thank you for accompanying me.
Yeah, of course.
But I've been working on that artist in residency project that they funded. It was a remote one.
Totally. Yeah, for those that may be unfamiliar, what does a residency in place mean?
In an artist's career, they might seek a residency, which is kind of like usually they're framed as an opportunity to isolate yourself and really dive into your artwork, or connect with a community of artists and dive in with them and reconnect and find new avenues to be creative. And so often it involves going somewhere, removing yourself from the normal flow of your life.
Totally.
But because of pandemic, many places that continued offering residencies offered what they called residency in place or remote residencies. And what that entailed in my case was carrying out a project in my own space, not going to New York where their location is. And they accommodated me in as many ways as they could.
Very cool.
As much, they tried to make it as regular as they possibly could. And so they funded a project and they gave me some marketing and publicity, but they also hooked me up in certain ways. Actually, just this past week, I had a meeting with Kevin Petrie, who is the man who wrote the book Glass and Print that I learned how to make my artwork through.
Oh, that's super exciting.
Yeah. So I first found out about him 12 years ago when I first learned this process. And through this residency, they were able to connect me to him. So there's been these little perks.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Find more information about the project that you're working on with IPCNY. You did a video about that recently, right?
I did, yeah. We made a video. It was an Instagram live event, and it's now it exists on IPCNY's account under their IGTV, and it was a live studio visit, about an hour long, where I had people come and sort of drop into my studio with me, and I tried to introduce them to the project I was working on and also my general working space.
Yeah.
And so that can be found on IPCNY's account. That's, I believe, at IPCNY, but also you can keep up with all the things that I have going on.
Totally.
My account, at keith.garuba on Instagram.
Awesome. You've been posting a lot recently.
Well, I've been sort of like having a lot of fun, just exploring my voice on there.
Totally.
And, the funny thing is, when you're crafting an artist statement, it's kind of scary, right? But one thing I've really been embracing on Instagram is like, I have like just as many shots as I want at crafting all kinds of statements.
Totally.
That's how I've been treating it.
Yeah. Your writing ability and your narrative style on there is amazing. I love reading it. It's so much fun. It's so different from what everybody else is doing, and it's definitely a unique take on everything.
Thank you so much. That
You're
means
very
a lot.
welcome.
Yeah.
For those listening, Keith is here to guest host with me. And we have a very exciting guest on today. Keith, who is our guest today?
Domenick Naccarato. Dom is a really cool guy. I mean, first, thank you for having me back to co-host this episode.
Of course.
Because it was so much fun. And when you invited me back, it was a no-brainer to say yes to because I have so much fun with you guys. But it was also, I was thrilled to be able to do an episode with Dom because I just love his work. And he's an artist I know first by being involved with him in the Lehigh Art Alliance.
Yeah.
And he makes these really cool kind of assemblage paintings. I was thrilled to speak with him.
Totally. Well, I'm going to go ahead and read his bio, and then we'll get right into our interview. Domenick Naccarato began his professional career in 1998 after receiving his BFA in Fine Art from the College of New Jersey. He has spent time wearing several different hats over the past 2 decades, including that of a web designer, web developer, graphic designer, creative director, marketing manager, and product manager. The single role that has been the common thread behind all of this is that of artist. Naccarato moonlights out of his basement workshop and studio, producing art that has been exhibited in and around the Lehigh Valley for the past 9 years. His style has been described as contemporary industrial, and he is regularly exhibited in seasonal shows at Connexions Gallery in Easton, PA, has exhibited at Bethlehem House Gallery in Bethlehem, PA, and has also been included in a number of solo, curated, and juried shows throughout the Valley. He currently sits on the board of the Lehigh Art Alliance and is a member of the Arts Community of Easton. Naccarato resides in Lower Macungie with his wife and 2 teenage daughters.
Dom, so I first know you from our interactions at the Lehigh Art Alliance.
Yeah.
Right. How long have you been involved with the LAA?
Oh, probably maybe a little bit longer than I've known you. I joined a number of years ago as a way of just sort of trying to meet new people within the art community throughout Lehigh Valley. I also knew, that they put on annual juried shows, so I saw it as an opportunity to start showing my work again. Because prior to joining the Lehigh Art Alliance, honestly, I think I had been living under a rock because I had no idea the extent and the breadth of the art community here in the Valley.
It's extensive.
It seriously is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, joining the LLA was, one of those things that it was like a gateway drug, right? It just opened you up to all these other opportunities. And, from there, I started meeting guys like you. I started meeting other friends within the community. They introduced me to, other gallery owners and folks doing things, creating shows and stuff like that. And so, so I've been a member ever since.
Yeah.
What has your role specifically with them looked like?
So when I started, I was just a member. I have helped them out over the years with things like maintaining their website, doing a little bit of the social media. I don't really do any of those things anymore. Most recently, I've just helped them raise some money to put toward the different projects that they have throughout the community. We have now an annual set of scholarships that we offer to high school students, graduating seniors, going into a career in art, going to school, that kind of thing.
Very cool.
Putting towards things like the Emmaus Public Library and the workshops that they're putting on over there and stuff like that.
Very cool.
It's funny how getting to know someone can be so context-based. So I think of you through that first.
Oh, do you really?
Yeah,
That's
but
funny.
Of course you're a whole artist with a whole history before that. I'm curious to hear about your artistic journey, how you began, how you got into what you do.
Sure. Like you've probably heard before, my mom always say that she knew I was going to be an artist the first time I ever picked up a crayon. As far as long back as I can remember, I was always interested in making things, drawing things, even painting things. I can remember having like a sketchbook and walking around my house as a kid and just drawing like whatever the random things were on the wall that my parents, had as their decor, right? Whether it was like another painting on the wall or like a cuckoo clock or something. And, so I was always that sort of creative kid. In school, the art teacher, gives you the project and you go do this thing. And like, I'm the one sitting on the side, like, I don't know, making it like somehow unique and different than everybody else.
Totally.
And that just sort of progressed. Going into high school and stuff, I knew definitely I wanted to focus on art, and had a great mentor, art teacher in school that sort of helped me, progress along, and to show me new styles of work, show me, different techniques. And, it's one of the things, it's just, I don't know, it's almost like an inherent part of me. I don't know what life is like not being an artist, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And I had a set of parents that were very supportive of a kid who wanted to pursue art. My dad would come home with, things of acrylic paint so that I could go paint, because I was just randomly painting in the basement. He would tape and record on old VHS recorder episodes of Bob Ross.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I could just go play them back anytime I wanted.
Totally.
And so he made me my first drafting table, right? He still has actually in his basement in his house.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
And it's just one of the things. It's like, you have parents that are just completely and utterly supportive of what you're doing. It just makes things a little easier.
Totally.
And then I can remember vividly telling my mom one day, I don't know, it was late in high school. We just happened to be sitting there in my room, and I said to her, it's like, I think I want to pursue a career in art. I don't know what that means, but I want to be an artist. And she was like, all right, well then, we'll figure out what that means. And so in some part it meant going to college and doing all that. And so when we started applying for schools and all that, it was in pursuit of an art degree. Again, I had, back then, this is like, I don't know, 1993, 1994, I had no idea what that even meant. And applied to a bunch of schools. I ended up getting in and going to Trenton State College.
Nice.
Now, at the time, it was still called Trenton State College. Halfway through my 4 years there, they changed the name to College of New Jersey. And that was quite an experience. From being, coming in, sort of not really knowing too much about art. I mean, we always, you always go to the field trips. You always go to the, growing up outside of New York City, going into the Metropolitan Museum of Art was like a no-brainer, right? That's what you did for your humanities trips and your art field trips and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
But I never really studied art, I knew what I liked. I knew visually what I liked, what I saw. But going to school for art and then being introduced to new people who had their own styles and professors who sort of opened up paths to all kinds of different things, that was a game changer. And, that was just, I still credit so much of my career as an artist to the 4 years I spent in college. And just the opportunity to explore things and experiment and, try new things and try new techniques, playing with tar. Do you know, I mean, I know you follow me and you know the kinds of things that I do, but the first time I ever played with roofing tar was when I was in college.
Oh, I was going to ask what kind of media you're into and what kind of work you were making. Yeah, all the way back then, you were already kind of...
So even all back then, I take a watercolor class, for example, and I pushed the limits. I probably pissed off some people doing so because I'm like, all right, so watercolor, what does that mean? Well, so here's a piece of paper. Now I'm going to adhere to maybe a piece of wood or something. And I'm not going to really use watercolor paint per se, but I'm going to use a whole bunch of stuff that I can stain the paper with using water and liquids.
Yeah.
It's still kind of watercolor-ish, right? And pick up a little dirt off the floor and mix it in. It's kind of got a muddy consistency, but it's still water-based, right? So how far can I push the limits here?
Yeah.
Even the mixed media classes that I remember that was it. It was a mixed media class that, we were doing something, and out in the balcony of one of the classrooms that, I don't know if it was the classroom we were in, but I remember the classroom specifically. It had a balcony, and along the railing of the balcony, they had tar on the railing to dissuade the birds from hanging out on the railings and pooping everywhere. And I remember grabbing some of this tar off the railing and smearing it onto the surface of the thing I was working on. And it became a medium in itself.
Spectacular,
right?
yeah.
And you're just like, okay, so it's mixed media, right? You told us to use different things, right? Not necessarily traditional. How about roofing tar? Does that count? that was kind of my mentality.
Oh, that's awesome.
You were just kind of experimental in nature.
Yeah, very much so. But I'll tell you this though. So it's a funny story. I remember early on, I was in a sculpture studio class. We were sort of sitting there waiting around for the class to start, the professor to show up, and one of my colleagues there, one of the other students came in, and I think he was a year older than me. I don't remember exactly what year he was, but he comes in and he sits down at the table. Now, mind you, in sculpture studio, especially at that time, you're basically just collecting garbage out of the trash, because that becomes your raw materials to go build whatever it is you're going to build, right?
Sure.
That was kind of a given, right? Because you've got to, first of all, you're a poor college kid, so you're not like buying new things, right?
Yeah.
You're just scavenging for whatever. And he brings in this, I don't know, it was like a 10-inch square piece of wood that had all this like just nasty, like it probably had like a dozen layers of paint on it, all like sort of chipping off and chipping away. It had like a nail head sticking out of the one corner, had like these stains on the back side of it. And he throws it down on the table, sitting in front of me there, and he points to it and he was like, "You see that?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "That's art." And I'm like looking at this thing and I'm looking at him, and it was like this epiphany. What he saw in that, and the crevices and the texture of the piece and just the grittiness, he saw something beautiful in that. And the moment he pointed it out to me, it was like all of a sudden everything changed. Everything. All the work I had been doing previous to that was just like, it was like a different world, a different time.
Mm.
Everything after that point, I started noticing things. You start noticing like the stain in the corner of the concrete floor, walking up the back stairwell, going up to the studios, right? And the way that the stain sort of, the etching of it, like starts creating these like textures and these shapes. And then you start noticing like, strange things like that, and it just took off from there. Everything about my work at that point was much more abstract in nature, taking a look at like little things and saying, okay, I really like the way that sort of grid pattern is happening on that curtain right there that I'm staring at.
Yeah.
How do I pull in that grid kind of composition into my work, right? Or like that, or the paint peeling off of an old board that was thrown in the dumpster somewhere. There's something inherently beautiful about that little vignette that I see all the time.
Totally.
From back then to today. And I mean, even, parking down the block and walking up here, I'm always like looking around and looking, you see these random construction signs and like the grit on them, and and like the number 3 is like half cut off because it was just, a truck ran over it like the previous week or whatever happened to it.
Sure.
Those kinds of things like stick out at me all the time now.
Yeah.
Because of that silly little 10 by 10 board that the kid threw on top of the workbench and was like, this random piece of trash, I think that's art. And I'm like, yeah, I agree with you. Like I see it too now.
Wow.
What an origin story for your voice.
Totally.
And it sounds like most of the ingredients for your mature work were you discovered during that time in school.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably, it was probably halfway through, and it just became very freeing. My painting became much more freer. I was doing very, like I said, I was watching Bob Ross videos. I was doing like realistic stuff, doing these like surrealistic paintings and stuff. And all of a sudden, the nature of abstract art, non-representational, because I see these surfaces and stuff. It's not like I'm trying to always recreate them or something, but I'm taking cues from them in a way, and it just, I don't know, it just opened my eyes to something totally different, totally unique, totally something that I had never experienced before. And painting got freer, my sculpture got freer, everything just got looser and definitely more rewarding,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of numbers built into your work as well.
Yeah.
And I'm curious where the inspiration for the numbers comes from.
Same thing. I mean, commuting to work, 476 Northeast Extension has been under construction for like the past 15 years. And I think literally since a year after moving from New Jersey to PA, that highway has been under construction.
Yeah.
And half my life has been spent commuting on that road. And, and you're sitting behind these giant trucks and tractor trailers, you can't help but see, at least I can't. I mean, the back of the tractor trailer has like all these like random serial numbers on it, tracking numbers or whatever it is that, the company is using to track the truck or the trailer. And I see those things, and I see the font that's used, and I see all that grit that's sort of built up over the years. And there's just something beautiful about the way that the sort of the water stains are kind of falling off the bolts and half covering up some of the numbering and the lettering or anything like that. And then even things like these like random construction signs going down there, they have like these random set of numbers on it. Those numbers mean something to somebody. I have no idea what the hell they mean, but they stick out at me,
Totally.
And it's stuff like that. You can see that all the time. If I live in Lower Macungie and right down in Emmaus, you got the train line that runs through there. And every once in a while, there'll be a set of train cars just sitting on the tracks. And you drive past those. When you get up close and personal, there is so much beauty in the way that some of those boxcars are rusting and, the graffiti and how that's sort of faded over time.
Totally.
And then, you've got the actual markings of the vehicle itself. And, there's just certain aspects of it that I don't know. It's like those little vignettes that I see that are beautiful to me. And so the numbers that end up appearing in a lot of my work are kind of a play off of that, and I don't even remember, it was probably a number of years ago where I started throwing the numerals and letters and stuff like that into the pieces, and it just sort of took off from there.
I only half joked with you at one point talking to you recently about how spectacular it would be if you could place one of those number paintings on Sesame Street.
That's right. That's right. I remember that.
And be among so many art, some of art's greatest.
Yeah, wouldn't that be funny?
That would be great. I think they'd be perfect for it. I
have to do like a sequential thing at some point. I've never done like a true sequential set of numbers or letters or anything.
Okay.
It's typically always random in nature unless someone's commissioned me to do something specific. But, sometimes it's a date, sometimes it's a year, whatever, but nothing ever like that where you'd be like, okay, it makes sense to actually have, say 26 pieces for 26 letters of the alphabet or whatever.
Oh, yeah. It would be awesome.
That would be interesting.
But I'm sure people do relate to your paintings in all kinds of ways because of those.
They do. And it's interesting over the years, you meet people when you're showing your work and there's something about that number or whatever that strikes them. It's a lucky number, or it's some, it happens to be the date that, their child was born, or it's their, I've got 3 kids, it's the number 3, or, whatever it might be. It's interesting how those things can resonate with people so well,
Yeah.
And some of the commissions I've done recently have been because of that. Where it's someone's anniversary and they're celebrating a year or how many years they've been married, and they, can you put number 23 into a piece for me, or something like that.
Yeah,
sure.
So it's really interesting though, because in some of your works, if you step away from the meaning of each number, the numbers really become pure abstract shape.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I have fun with them sometimes where, because the way on the bigger pieces, the way that I put the number on the surface is I'll actually project it. So I've got the painting up on an easel in the studio. I've got the letter or the numeral being projected, and I start sort of fooling around with like how close and how far off to the side that the board, the surface is from the projection, and you end up like accidentally kind of coming up with your composition.
Totally.
Right? Because I love it when I can, when I see the number sort of cut off on its edges and stuff like that. But again, it kind of plays off of some of these things that I see. There was, I had a new roof put on my house a couple years back, and the company had a big dumpster in my driveway. And, the letters and the markings on the dumpster were just gorgeous. I mean, I was sitting there like taking pictures of the thing. My neighbors probably thought I was crazy. It's like, why is he taking pictures of the dumpster?
Sure.
Right? That's like my thought of what their thought is going through their head. But anyway, like you see these like little vignettes, and sometimes the vignette, it's not the full number. It's just something, a piece of it maybe, or because it's literally been peeled off, you only see that aspect of it.
Totally.
There's a school of graphic design that's like that too. Back in the late 90s, I can remember you get my roommates in school used to get issues of Ray Gun magazine.
Oh yeah, okay.
And Ray Gun had that sort of style and that vibe.
Totally.
Letters half cut off, numbers half cut off, letters upside down or reversed. Things like that.
Yeah, it's very sci-fi dystopian.
Yeah. There's a grunginess to it too that I love.
Totally.
That's how some of my recent pieces, those number word vignettes, where I'm kind of combining the number with the actual word itself of the number, just putting them into like interesting, fun compositions where half is getting cut off, or it's like, a piece of it is upside down or sideways. Yeah. Just fooling around with the composition was actually a lot of fun doing that little project.
Well, I find those really interesting too, because I mean, in this modern life we're kind of like being shouted at by all of these signs and symbols everywhere we look, and numbers do that. But in your paintings, the numbers kind of fray at the edges into just visual phenomena in a way, if you allow your mind to go there. But when you have the words there reaffirming the meaning of the number, now there's a push and a pull that I think is really fascinating.
That's funny. That's an interesting way of putting it, that push and the pull.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were interesting to do. That project actually started in Photoshop. So, just taking those numbers, the words, and just throwing them around, almost like using it as a sketchbook in a way. Totally. Right? Trying to find an interesting layout for that particular number. And then using that as sort of my foundation and bringing it to life in the finished piece. And they're small. They're only like yay big. Maybe, I don't know, 11 by 11, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
That is super cool.
I love hearing you talk about your process and how these things are made. And I love keeping up with you online and seeing the videos that you make, because they're so informative and they bring the making of these things so much to life. You're good at capturing how it's done. But what I find almost a little bit funny and ironic is that you seem to be very craft-minded. I could tell that you really care about how something is made correctly and you want something to be done well. And then you end up with a product that has so much of this aging and weatheredness and raw delivery. Mm-hmm. I would love to hear you talk about maybe where you define that line between, like, where you're able to break yourself away from, okay, now I'm doing something really tight and well, and now I want it to have this kind of a texture and finish that's
Yeah, there's that's an interesting question too. There's definitely a fine line between that sort of grunginess that I end with versus the sort of the composition that I typically start with. And the process of getting there is interesting because a lot of it has to do with the sort of the techniques of the materials that I'm using to sort of build up the surface and then start playing around with like objects maybe or a piece of metal or whatever it might be, right? Like I'm staring at the piece behind Ben right here that I brought in, using that as a reference. So most of my stuff are hard surfaces, right? It's typically like a plywood surface. So that lets me, obviously that lets me beat on it, lets me screw into it, lets me cut into it. Okay, right. So easy enough. From there, after priming the surface and whatnot, I usually put on, not always, but I usually put on a layer of joint compound. That joint compound gives me almost like right away, gives me that sort of layer of texture. I'll do sort of like a knockdown texture technique. You see it in like, nice fancy plaster walls or ceilings or stuff like that. But that it's like instant texture, right? That joint compound, that layer there. But sometimes like what I'll do is I'll embed a wire or a fabric mesh in the compound to give me that extra depth. It's also a structural component too, because it just gives extra rigidity to that plaster surface. But from there, I might have a composition in mind, right? But that's kind of like one of the first steps in the sequence where it's almost automatic. Like I do that almost no matter what, right? When I start a piece. But after that, that's when things start just happening, sometimes spontaneously. I have a certain, dare I say, color palette that I tend to stick with. I don't know if that's by design. I don't know if that's by accident. I mean, half the colors that I used to paint with were literally leftover paint from like house projects. It just happened to be colors that my wife and I were a fan of, and we wanted to paint our family room that color. Totally. Right. And so that maroon that's in that piece right there is definitely a holdout of that kind of color scheme that used to be in our old house. Right. But so after that whole thing of adding the texture to it and all that, is when I start thinking more about the composition of the piece. And so, in a case like that, like this one here, I say, all right, well, so I want to have this kind of groove, this embedded groove across the middle of the piece. Let me take it over to the workshop and I'll run it through, my table saw or my router, and I'll cut a rabbet across it. Okay. So now I have that. And, again, in my head, I know I have these sort of like these kinds of lines that I want to have vertically situated. So how can I create those? Well, I'm a big fan of hardware. I have a bit of a hoarding habit when it comes to objects like that, whether it's nuts and bolts or gears or, pieces of metal or steel, or sometimes, but like in those cases here in this particular piece, it's going shopping at Home Depot and getting tie straps that are used in construction and using that as my material to add the sort of the vertical nature of those lines there. And it's, sometimes it's just a game of arranging them on the surface. I do tend to like symmetry. So a lot of the things, especially lately, are fairly symmetrical. And, it's like kind of like, what's the time of day and how am I feeling that day? This one wanted to be, have those blue tints to it and the yellows and stuff like that. Other times doesn't want that. It wants to be just sort of this beige or off-white color. So color is kind of random in nature when it comes to actually creating the work and that part of the process. I try to stick with a few colors for a particular piece, but then it can vary to the next piece, for example. And then, okay, so once I've got that, I've got the composition down, I've got those things down, I know I'm going to screw them in, I've got paint on the surface already. at that point, it's like, all right, so I know I need to start like weathering this thing, right? So how do I do
Totally.
that? So I take a palm sander to the surface. I start sanding over top of all that plaster, that joint compound there. And that's where you start exposing you start ripping off like that layer of paint, exposing the raw joint compound behind it, for example, or whatever it might be. If maybe it's just another layer of paint that I've added behind that. And, once you get that, and I'm pretty happy with what I have. One of the last things that I do almost in every single situation is I completely cover the surface. The entire thing in a coat of roofing tar. Okay. It's black. Like it's literally like coated in this black crap, right? And what happens is the staining effect of the oil and the tar ends up staining all of those exposed areas of like the joint compound that I sanded down. It starts filling into the crevices of what's left from the textures that I've created. It starts filling it and making its way into sort of like around the circumference of the screws that you see there. And you end up with this sort of like automatic like weathering effect because I start wiping away all that excess material, all that excess tar, and you're just left with the staining effect of it.
Yeah.
And that's how I end up getting a lot of those colorations around the corners and the edges. And then you can play with it a little bit more too, so I use mineral spirits to thin the tar. And when you start throwing some mineral spirits onto the surface, the mineral spirits has this effect of like spreading the stain of the tar, and you end up getting these like cool little things happening in like the upper left corner of that piece where you start seeing, it almost looks like droplets and stuff. Yeah. And so, I start doing that on purpose where, you just sort of dip a brush in the paint thinner, the mineral spirits, and you just sort of splatter it onto the surface, and it just will randomly in those spots just sort of spread the tar, the staining of the tar. And then, from there, it's more, okay, so trying to fine tune it. Like, okay, so, are there elements of the hardware that need a little highlighting? So I have a bunch of oil sticks that I love using, and I'll use some oil sticks and start maybe putting some, white highlights on some of the elements, or red, or whatever the color might be. Maybe some extra blue in the areas where there's more blue, and just kind of working that. But then that's really it. I mean, that ends up building up that those layers and stuff. Very lastly, I typically put a layer of polyurethane over top of the piece. Sometimes I'll just spray it on if it's a smaller surface. Other times I'll just brush it on, and that has a whole effect too, because the yellowing effect just ends up sort of popping the color.
Totally.
And then obviously protecting the surface itself. Now there's stages in that, because there's time necessary for layers to dry, right? I need to let the roofing tar staining dry, right? So I always have I have my windows open in my basement. I'm always getting the air circulation and get the fan going, so I can get a breeze across the pieces to just kind of speed that process up. Or in some cases, like if I'm being impatient, I'll just use my heat gun and I'll dry the surface that way.
Wow. And after all that labor, you're left with something that unmistakably looks like a Dom Naccarato. And you have such a strong voice, and you'd know a Dom if you've seen one. Does this piece have a name?
It does. Yeah. So wait, let me look it up real quick.
Well, while you're looking that up, one of the things that we love to do on the show is audio description of the pieces. I would love it if you could describe for the audience the piece as you see it.
Wow. Okay. All right. So this one's called 4 12-gauge strap ties across a textured surface. It's 23.5 inches by 23.5 inches square. The mediums that I've used for this piece are strap ties, screws, washers, wire mesh, latex paint, oil stick, roofing tar, and polyurethane on a plywood surface. The piece has a sort of primarily blue and yellowish tint to it. It has these 4 tie straps that are vertically aligned in the center of the piece. The tie straps themselves have a sort of a weathered maroon finish to them. The screws that are used to adhere them to the surface, they're sort of actually, they're highlighted by the light in this room, which is kind of cool. So they have, they have elements of some paint and oil stick and whatnot, sort of embedded in there, in the little hashes there of the screw heads. Those vertical tie straps run across a horizontal rabbet that goes from one end of the piece to the right. Embedded in there is a wire mesh adhered to it with 2 screws on either end. Behind the tie straps, sort of encompassing each one of them, is a sort of a swipe of sort of whitish color hue paint, clearly stained by the roofing tar that's across the whole surface. The surface itself is looks very weathered and worn. Elements of it, as you can see, sort of have been sanded through, and with the roofing tar staining all those elements, just creating different sort of little vignettes of color and texture and surface area that encompass the whole piece. I don't know if I did a good job explaining that, but
you killed it.
I think that was great.
That was amazing. When you see this piece right now, is there a specific part of it that calls out to you the most?
There's something about that wire mesh in the middle of it. It's almost like there's something back there just kind of holding it together.
Totally.
Holding the two halves together. Even though I know clearly, it's a solid surface, but it sort of goes back to that idea of just like finding these interesting things and seeing, what you ever go, you ever see a Jersey barrier on the side of the highway, and like it's sort of the concrete, clearly it's so old, the concrete's deteriorating, and you see the rebar inside of it.
Sure,
totally.
That's the kind of thing that is in the sort of the back of my head when I'm creating something like that.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
And
is that a part of the joy to you, almost the fictional structure?
Yeah, very much so. There's definitely something about the hardware itself that I'm drawn to. I've always, I'm pretty handy. I love tools. I love building things. And so I'm very comfortable with hardware, right, in general. But then I'm really interested in like aspects of construction and that sort of thing. So, and the process behind, what does it take to create a Jersey barrier, right? Pouring the concrete, mixing it, making sure that the rebar is formed correctly, pouring it into the form, et cetera, right? But then what happens 25 years later, right? What happens to the sort of deterioration of that concrete 25 years later, after all the abuse of it being thrown onto the center highway during a construction site, being dragged around by a front end loader or whatever to be placed somewhere? What's the story behind that thing, right? That element, and why did it get marked with the number 6?
Totally.
I don't know. Just those things are kind of interesting to me,
Yeah.
And so, like, anytime I'm creating a piece like that, it's this sort of thing that's sort of in the back of my head, And again, I'm not necessarily trying to replicate that.
Sure.
It's the elements of that thing, that object, or that little vignette, or the side of the train car that I've noticed that I sort of keep in the back of my head when I'm creating these things.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's incredibly relatable as well. It pushes people to see a piece like yours, appreciate the detail that went into it, and then look around themselves and say, oh my goodness, there's a level of detail in everything around me that I may not have noticed in the past.
Yeah, whether it's accidental or purposeful.
Yeah, exactly.
To that point, do you also maybe hope that a viewer might also appreciate the constructedness and the madeness of our built environments?
Yeah, sure.
But, I guess I ask that because it's almost the inverse of something I often think when I look at your works, which is that these things don't look like they had recent human intervention. And I guess that's the goal of weathering something, right?
Yeah. I've joked before that there are times where I'm like, I've tried to create the piece in such a way that I made it look like I took a Sawzall to the back of the train car, cut it out, and framed it. Right.
Totally.
And so the aspect of it, of the surface itself appearing as if I found it like that, that's definitely intriguing. You know, there's, if you look through sort of the collection of work that I've had now over the past, say, you know, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, there are pieces that stick out in my head that are very much like that. Right. There's a piece I have a piece hanging at the Rotunda Gallery right now in the Art Narrative show that's up there, and there's a piece that's sort of that, you know, that it takes its cues from like the side of a dumpster, right? Mm-hmm. It's got the lettering that's all weathered. In fact, it's on steel, like the surface itself is steel, and so I purposely rusted it, right? I had these giant hunker of a set of bolts that I screwed into it, you know. To make it almost appear like, wait, is that art? Did he make that, or did he just find that somewhere? And there's a certain aspect to that that's kind of fun, right? And there's only been a handful of pieces I've created over the years that are of that nature, but it's always fun talking to someone, talking to them about the piece, talking about the process, and then it dawns on them that, wait a minute, I didn't just pick that out of the trash. Like, I made it look like that.
Totally.
You know, that's an interesting sort of perspective too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. It's like you see Hollywood films, right? And period pieces. You're like, wow, those are brand new costumes that they have an entire weathering department brought on to make them look that way.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't even think about it. You're like, that's the way that it's always been. It's like, no, actually, it existed in that state. It's brand new, but looks that way now.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that stuff. Who's the dude from Mythbusters?
Adam Savage.
Yeah. So if you ever watch some of his videos and some of the things that he creates, making the costumes, he has some amazing weathering techniques that he applies to his objects.
Oh yeah.
That I just find amazing, right? How you can create something like that, brand new, but make it look like it's been sitting around for the past 40 years.
Totally.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But in your work, it's not just a roughly applied patina of some kind, right? It's all super deliberate, and you can tell when you've seen lots of your work because there's a consistency.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, there's definitely consistency to it. And there's typically always a deliberate nature to, especially the compositions. There's a lot of the things that I can't control when it comes to the way that the tar, for example, stains the surface. When I'm in that particular step of the process and I wipe away all that excess tar, it's almost like this unveiling that happens. And I don't always know what I'm going to get. And actually, I mean, 99% of the time, I don't quite know what I'm going to get. I have an idea, right? I know because I stand at that top right corner, I'm going to get more staining effect there than like on the white where I didn't touch it.
Totally.
Right? I get that, but then otherwise, it's kind of this sort of like, I don't know, this game really, where you're doing all this stuff. You get to this point where I'm saying, okay, now just cover it in darkness, and now let me sort of bring it back into the light. Let me expose it and let me see really for the first time what it's going to end up being. And most of the time that works. And sometimes it doesn't.
Totally.
Sometimes it does. Sometimes you end up with a hot mess.
Yeah.
And, I kind of have to figure out a way to fix that or clean it up or just scrap it and start over.
Yeah.
Do you scrap many?
No, but I have painted over things where, there's something that I just never was quite happy with. So it sort of just sits there on my, painting rack. And then 4 years later, when I'm in need of a new surface, I see that and I'm like, yeah, it's time to paint over that thing, sand it down and just start over.
Totally.
I've done that a number of times with older work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So they'll be looking through an x-ray someday and uncovering the layers, the archaeology of down.
I guess so, yeah.
I've been using the word painting, and I'm trying to remember if you have too. Do you consider these paintings?
Most of the times I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so either they've been called assemblage art, they've been called paintings, they've been called sculptural paintings, but I think painting is a good kind of catch-all, to describe it.
Yeah. What makes something a painting? Is that kind of taxonomy even important to you?
No, because I've done a number of things that you could argue are definitely much more sculptural in nature. Some kind of wall hanging, for lack of a better phrase, that are definitely not painting. But I don't know. I don't know if painting, if something needs to be painterly and to have a painterly sort of process to it in order to be considered a painting. I call that a painting because I did apply paint to it.
Yeah, definitely.
It definitely has some paint to it, right? Would I call that a painting if there was absolutely no paint on it? Probably not.
Interesting.
When you're taking inspiration from these vignettes that you've mentioned that are all around in life, will you often take a picture of them, or are they the kind of thing that you kind of think about and then just kind of internalize and think about when you are creating?
I used to take a lot more pictures of those things. I haven't recently. I probably only because there's just a plethora of that in the palm of my hand in my phone, right? But yeah, there were definitely times where like I'd be driving down the highway and I'd be stuck behind a truck and I'd start I see something and then I go fumble for my phone to try to take a quick picture of it or a reference shot or something like that.
Totally.
So I have an older Google Photos album that has a bunch of those kinds of reference shots. But no, but for the most part, it's just the kinds of things that are sort of the thoughts in the back of my head, that are sort of just there, that I think some of the pieces sort of take their cues from,
When you see those things, do you almost are you planning your recreation, your approach to emulating textures?
I think it's just I think a lot of it is just about the texture and maybe like, again, say if I'm adding a number to a piece or something like that, and I happen to notice a number on the back of a truck or whatever it might be, where an element of it, part of it is just sort of scraped off or cut off or whatever. Those are the kinds of things where I'm like, okay, I want to try to figure out how to replicate that aspect of it.
Totally.
But in terms of the compositions themselves, it's a real random thing that just sort of ends up happening. I'll go through times where these kinds of things just sort of pop into my head. The symmetry of those four things across the surface and across the horizontal grid like that, the composition itself is what appears in my head, right? The lines, right, and the shapes, not necessarily the sort of the surface or the textures or even the colors. I keep a tiny little sketchbook that I've probably had it for like 10 years. Because I don't use it all that often, but every once in a while, if I have it with me, we go on a family vacation and I'm sitting at the beach or something like that, and something pops in my head, I just jot down like a really quick, sort of back of the napkin type of sketch in it. And it's primarily all about the sort of the composition of that thing, whatever it might be that sort of just I envisioned. Yeah. And then I use those as references when I'm like, okay, now I'm in my studio and like, all right, I got the hunkering, right? You have that, there's something in you as an artist, you need to create. So it's like, okay, well, what do I create? And I go back to that and I say, okay, let me take a look at this composition and let me see if I can bring that to life with whatever I have. And I've got a stockpile of these brackets and I've got all this like wire mesh and all this stuff. And oh yeah, I've got a few sheets of plywood. So let me see, what happens when I cut these things up and put them together. That's kind of how these things sort of come to life. And so those things like the surfaces, the vignettes and whatnot that I come across, those are sort of just the extra elements that I'm like, okay, how do I bring those things that I really love, that I really dig, into the surface of that particular composition?
Totally.
And I mean, even the recent series with the number word vignettes, it's the same sort of thing. I mean, like I said earlier, I started those things in Photoshop, but it was a very rough sketch of just sort of the composition of the number and the word and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so I take that composition, put it to life, bring it to life on the surface, but then, then I go to town on it, right? And the going to town is sort of just, it's almost like playing, right? You're just sort of experimenting, going back to the nature of like just sort of seeing what happens if I mix oil and latex. And okay, I know that's not good, but like what really is going to happen if I do that, right? How can I make the paint crack off maybe, or if I sand it too much, like what happens if I sand it too much,
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that starts happening.
Yeah, that's great. So you've told us about, your creative mind when you're out on safari looking at the world and your creative mind as you're working through that process. But I'd also love to hear about now as you start to talk about experimentation, how you've kind of built your studio and your space to facilitate that kind of working.
So I have about, I don't know, I think it's like an 800 square foot basement, something like that, maybe a little shy of that. And I sort of have it split in two. I have a wall between the two sides where I have more of like what you would most like traditional, like it looks like a traditional workshop, like a wood shop on the one side. And I've got that walled off so I can close the door so I can make dust on that side. The other side is sort of like more the studio side, if you will, or the clean side. I have a big workbench there. I typically work flat, and that's where most of the surfaces come to life on that side. I also have my home office there, so I got to keep things kind of clean on that side. But there is a lot of sort of back and forth that I do between these two spaces, right? Where, like the piece that we keep describing here tonight, a lot of that I've got to bring into the workshop so I can bring it through the router table, for example, to route that rabbit through the middle of it.
Totally.
Or, if I'm sanding the surface, I like to do that on the workshop side because I know it's going to be a mess and I got to wear a dust mask and all that stuff. Whereas on the other side, the clean side is where I'm doing the painting, where I'm fooling around with the surface and making my marks and all that good stuff. So there's a lot of like sort of back and forth, between those two spaces. I typically have a bunch of workbenches, so most of the time I work flat on the surface. So I have all my, all the materials and all that junk, and then the surface itself is flat on the workbench. I'll throw it up on the easel every once in a while to kind of be able to take a step back from it and see how it's sort of coming together. Or, if I'm in early stages, maybe it's something as simple as like just kind of holding one of the brackets up on the thing and sort of like positioning and seeing like where I think it might make sense. And sometimes that is easier if I put it on the easel, but I don't typically work off of the easel,
Yeah.
But yeah, having the shop and the studio sort of combined like that, it's the kind of thing where, again, it's like I go back to my days in school. Like I always found myself painting in the sculpture studios and building things there and stuff like that, where I rarely hung out in the painting studios painting,
Mm-hmm.
And I always like, I always like that, the notion of like needing to use power tools to make my art.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, kind of having a workshop handy and all that stuff just sort of makes sense for what I do.
Sure. I'm going to go psychoanalytic on you and ask if you're trying to recapture a bit of your dad building your first drawing table.
Probably, man. My dad's a handy guy. Like, growing up, I always saw him doing things, fixing things, whatever. My uncle's a contractor, and he my high school summer jobs were, putting roofs on houses and digging trenches along foundations. Like, so I'm very comfortable around that kind of thing. And so it sort of makes sense bringing that into my work.
Totally.
And it's very fitting, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, we've talked a lot about the aesthetic inspiration, and I'd love to know what the emotional core of your work is, or what you would consider the emotional core of your work.
You're getting deep on me now, man.
It's bound to happen at some point.
At its core, it's my desire to make art and create things. I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
I think I've heard some of the other folks that you've interviewed talk about this. I mean, as an artist, and this probably too, as an artist, you have this sort of burning desire to create. Like, you're not whole unless you're creating art. Whether that's a drawing in a sketchbook, or a print, or a giant mural on the side of the building in Easton somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? You've got this burning desire to create and make art and, do something like that. And that's, for me, that's all it's about. I don't feel like I'm myself when I haven't created something,
Totally. When you are creating something, when do you know it's done? When do you know that you've reached the final stages and the end of a piece? So
I think, in my world, because so much of the creation process is very, there's almost like a methodical step-by-step nature to some of the stuff that I create. At least, the way I've sort of laid it out in my head.
Yeah.
That, you can, I don't know, in some ways, like, I can tell, like, when I'm saying, like, I'm getting to a point where, so as an example, I can't add a layer of roofing tar over top of the surface until I'm pretty confident that all my painting and the coloring and all that is done.
Okay.
Right? Because I can't, unless I'm going to throw more oil paint over top of the surface.
Sure.
Which I don't always use. I typically use, like, latex house paint. I can't put oil over top of that latex and then put more latex over top of that oil. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, it won't work.
So I have to be pretty confident at that point that I'm like, okay, I'm ready for this. And then you sort of, I think as any artist who's been doing this for a long time will tell you, you get to a point where you can kind of feel it and you see it, and the composition has spoken to you enough that, you're ready to move on to the next step. And maybe that next step is completion, or maybe that next step is just adding some other accoutrement to it.
Yeah.
But it has to talk to you, and you have to be able to have that kind of conversation with the piece. It sounds kind of kitschy, but you have to let the piece talk to you, right?
Well, I got to tell you.
Yeah, you're nodding your head. You know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly. But also, I'm a little bit jealous of you that you can say things like, I don't know how that color kind of happened, or why those colors. The piece just kind of spoke to me, just like you're saying now, right? The speech just kind of needed it. The piece wanted it. Because, not everyone... it doesn't come that naturally for people where they know what the piece needs that way. Maybe you're a good listener.
Maybe it's a dance. You have to equate it like you're having this sort of dance with the piece, right? And you're having a conversation with it. I don't know what. Pick your analogy, right? You're having this conversation with the piece, and you got to be able to listen, and you got to be able to talk, and you be like, no, I don't want to do this. I want to do this instead, and then take it that direction and see what happens. I think you also have to be willing to fail, and I've definitely failed a lot over the years with the pieces where, I have some sort of crazy idea and I try to execute, and it's just a bomb, but I think you have to be accepting of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So then I'm curious if you're the kind of person who's very intensely in the moment focused on the particular paintings that are present in your studio, or if you're someone like so many artists who kind of develops an idea debt where you've kind of got a backlog of all kinds of ideas you want to execute, or maybe in your case, all kinds of materials you can't wait to get into a piece.
So I don't have that much of a backlog of ideas.
Okay.
That sketchbook I mentioned earlier, I've got a few things in there that I haven't touched yet that, one of these days it'll be cool to create something based on that thing or whatever, that sketch or whatever it might be. But there's not a huge volume of that. Most of the stuff that I work on, it's interesting because I do tend to work a lot in series. Those number word vignettes I've been working on now for the past, I don't know, probably start of the pandemic, right? So maybe a little over a year and a half now or so. And that series is just about like run its course.
Okay.
Right.
You're feeling that way.
Yeah. Yeah, you do. You get to a point where you're just sort of like, I'm kind of done with that. Right. And so, sometimes frankly, you just get bored of it.
Sure.
Right. But again, it's the kind of thing where you have to sort of have that conversation with the work and with yourself. Like, is this done? Right. Or do I have maybe I have more in me? These kinds of things here, I find myself sort of going in and out of these paintings that have all these different objects and whatnot. Where I may work on a series that has, a bunch of cogs or gears in them or something.
Yeah.
And then, maybe I don't touch those for a few years, and instead I start using the more flat pieces of hardware like the tie straps or something. That wire mesh stuff, I started using this over the past year or so, and that wire mesh has been making its way into a handful of the pieces lately too. So some of it is about experimenting with new materials too. And I think in some part too, you get to a point where like you sort of just kind of done with it. And there'll be times where like, maybe a month, maybe 2 months goes by and I haven't created a single thing. And that's where that sort of that burning desire starts creeping
I definitely
back in.
get that.
And you're just like, okay, wait a minute. No, like I haven't produced anything in a while. I need to refocus my efforts and
Totally.
start doing stuff.
Totally.
But the other thing too is like time, right? Like I have a full-time job and I have a, family. I've got kids in high school, sports, activities, and, there's a lot of other things going on in life in general. And so I tend to work in sprints on my work. It's rare that I can get maybe on a Saturday I can get like a few hours, 4 or 5 hours at a time after mow the lawn and taking care of everything else. And there's nothing else going on. But things like, working at night, for example, right? You got a long day, worked all day long. Maybe you got a soccer game I got to go to at the end of the night and watch my kid play her sport. And that's all great. You come home, you're like, all right, so I have 2 extra hours here. So let me see what I can just work on a particular piece in 2 hours. And I've gotten very accustomed to working on my projects, on my pieces in sprints, right? So, I can't even tell you like how long it would take for a full piece to go from start to finish because I can't keep track of it, right? Like I don't know what it's like to be in the studio for say, 3-4 days straight just working on stuff. Like that doesn't, that's foreign to me. I work on it in between life, if you will.
Yeah, right. That's always a funny question when someone asks you how long something took. It sounds like in your case, it might be, you mean how many meals?
Yeah.
I can log that in how many meals I made for my family.
Yeah, or something like that.
Yeah.
You're just sort of doing it in between things. But that's my experience. I mean, that's not everybody else's experience. You have your sort of work ethic and your studio life, and that's going to be completely different than what mine looks like.
Yeah.
It's for me, it's what works. Right.
Totally.
It's that I always said, again, go back to school. I said to one of my professors once that I wanted to be an artist and have a family and have a job at the same time. And he was like, good luck with that. Right. Because it's not easy. It's definitely not been easy,
Totally.
But, you just sort of make it happen. Right. You want to have a good life. You want to have a good job.
Totally.
You want to have, a great family. You want to be able to provide for them. You want to be able to make them dinners at night. And you want to be this artist. there's, you want to show, you want to talk to cool guys like you, you know what I mean? You want all this stuff, right? And you being me, I want all this stuff.
Sure.
And so you got to figure out how to balance it all, right? But that's part of the game too, man.
Totally. Yeah, I was going to ask whether you would consider that part of your process.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be. I think I've learned how to do that too. I mean, I mentioned like the heat gun. Like the heat gun has been my best friend at times because I can dry something really quick. Like, when it comes to like a latex paint or something like that, you can dry something really quick and be able to move on to the next step or whatever it is that I'm doing. Otherwise, like if I had to wait, any sort of length of time, it's like, all right, well, I just have to do it and I just have to wait.
Sure.
But sometimes I'll do that where I plan out my day that way, or I'll plan out like a piece or something. I mean, I wake up real early in the morning and before work, if I have some time, like I'll throw on like a layer of joint compound onto the surface because I know that needs at least 24 hours to dry before I can, prime it again. So if I have an extra, half hour before I have to actually start my day, then yeah, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to do that. Right.
Totally.
But that's also the benefit of having a studio in your own home, right? You can kind of do things in between. I think a lot of people think, oh, you have your studio in your own home. That's great because then you can spend hours upon hours upon hours in your own studio. But you really can't do that with this whole other thing called life around
Sure.
you.
Sure. Well, I love that discussion of balancing it all. I want to know if you sleep.
So I actually sleep more now than I used to. I used to find myself working really late into the hours of the night. But as I've gotten older, my body cannot handle that.
Mm-hmm.
So I need my, my 7-8 hours of sleep.
Yeah.
I think in some ways, that actually has forced me to figure out how to work in between other things, but yeah, sleep is important. You have to sleep.
Yeah. I think that it sounds like you really shifted your studio practice to fit the intensities of life and the practicalities of time limitations. And it sounds like it's made you describe them as sprints. It sounds like it's brought an intensity to the way that you approach the projects you can do when you are in the studio.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it has.
Yeah.
I think it has.
You've mentioned that you don't have the luxury of going into the studio 3-4 days in a row. If you had the ability to, is that something that you would do, or is that something you wouldn't necessarily be interested in?
Oh yeah. Oh no, I would definitely.
Yeah.
If I had the means and the ability, that is something that I think eventually I'll get there for sure. But as I said, right now it's sort of a different time, right? I could see myself maybe having a studio in perhaps like outside of my home. I know, right? You're not at the banana factory, right?
I am.
You
now,
you
yes.
are. You are. So yeah. So that's a perfect example, right? So you leave your home, almost like you're going to work in the morning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you go to your studio and you do your studio time, right? You told me earlier you're a full-time artist now, right? So that's the kind of thing that I think any artist would strive for, really. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely something that I've always sort of envisioned, like, okay, yeah, eventually that's the kind of thing that I'd love to be able to get to. Mm-hmm. But first I have to figure out how to pay for my kids' college to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
When it comes to marketing your work and posting on social media, what percentage of time does that take up for you?
I mean, I'll say this. I don't think I'm all that great at social media and promoting myself on something like Instagram, for example. I try, and I definitely put effort into it. And the interesting thing about that is that those platforms are always changing. And then you look at the emphasis that Instagram is now putting on video, for example, in these reels, right? Mm-hmm. Looking at, basically competing against TikTok. You say, okay, all right, how do I take that and bring that into the fold, right? Put that into the studio and turn that into something that potentially is a way to market my work, right? Because ultimately, that at the end of the day, that's what it's going to be as a tool for, right? It's to help us as artists market ourselves.
Yeah, for sure.
And what I have found to be most interesting and the most enjoyable, I'll say, is when I do these videos on like my process, right? Because in a way, it's me being able to sort of show like how it is that I produce these things. I do enjoy sort of the aspect of, setting up the camera, putting it on a tripod, and then just, getting B-roll and shooting that and then stitching it all together or Premiere or whatever.
Totally.
Maybe doing a voiceover these days, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
And just seeing what happens. But then you have you have the real thing or you have the TikTok thing and you got like 30 seconds to do that. Yeah. And you're like, well, how am I supposed to do all that in 30 seconds?
Yeah.
Right. So
totally.
Yeah. So like the past couple of videos that I've put out there really have just been this sort of like detailed vignettes of the piece, right? Where maybe I take a picture of the piece after I've completed it, post it on my main, what do you call it? Your main feed, right?
Yeah.
Of your Instagram.
Yeah.
And then I'll do a 30-second video of like sort of the details of the piece going through it and then put that on the sort of the reel section. But I don't know. I don't know if that's even working, frankly. And you
it's a game.
It is kind of a game. And,
Yeah.
and as a video guy yourself, like
Totally.
like it when you start doing video, it takes time.
It takes a lot of time.
And from my perspective, is the time that I put into trying to edit some silly video that someone's going to see for maybe 30 seconds, maybe, right? It's a blink of an eye. It's a swipe of a finger. The amount of time that it takes to actually do that and set up the tripod and do, you want to make it interesting. So you got to get a couple different angles. And, I've seen your videos. I know you're trying to do the same thing.
Sure. Yeah.
It's challenging. And it's in a way, it impedes your process.
Oh, yeah. Well, because the artifice is all very silly too. Because, all right, I'm going to go set up the tripod, walk over here, act like I was doing what I was doing.
No,
do a small fragment of it.
No, it's insane. We're crazy.
Yeah.
When we do stuff like that, right? For what? Yeah. For a handful of extra likes to try to build up a following because everybody happens to say that it's like the panacea of like your marketing tool, right?
Totally.
It's throwing your work on Instagram.
Totally.
So it's the kind of like, what do they call it? It's like a necessary evil.
Yeah.
It's in a way that's what all that social media stuff is for artists.
Totally. Sure. Totally. I am a video guy that has not on my own personal pages made a single reel because I know how much of a perfectionist I am and I know how much time I'll put into something like that. And it takes a lot of courage for me to do something like that. And I don't know if I have it in me at this point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you.
Well, yeah. And, you really got to keep discipline to not let that become the art object instead of the thing that you're trying to do.
Well, unless that's what you want. I mean,
unless that's what
there's
you
want, there's a lot of guys doing that, that sort of thing and making it very interesting, But if you're more of, I'm not going to call myself a traditional artist, but if you're more of a traditional artist, then that kind of thing can get in your way, frankly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Until that one shining person comes through and gives you that authentic, connection comment that kind of makes you feel validated for your work.
Yeah.
Totally.
Ironically enough, I don't enjoy talking about my work.
Is that true?
No, that's totally true.
Wow. Can you tell us about that?
What do you want to know?
Well, I think that's really interesting. I kind of think, and I'm not putting this on you, you tell me if this is true of you, but I think that it's true of some artists that they got into this visual medium sometimes because they didn't want to put their feelings, thoughts, whatever ideas into words. And then very often artists have to end up putting it back into words at the end.
Yeah. Isn't it very ironic?
Yeah.
I mean, Ben, you asked me for a bio and artist statement. I'm like, oh crap. All right, let me dig that up somewhere in my Google Docs and see what I can throw together and make it current. Yeah. Right? Because it's not current ever.
Yeah, I get that.
No, it's one of those things where I think it's a learned trait. I think you have to figure out along the way how to be able to talk about your work, simply as a way of being able to communicate it and be able to, if you want to be able to, talk to a patron, talk to a collector about your work and, sort of get that out there, you have to talk, right? And you have to be able to talk about it. I don't think I talk about my work well, frankly. Maybe you might disagree, I don't know, but I've never enjoyed talking about my work.
So interesting. I
Never.
think I do disagree.
Yeah.
I caught you at when you had that solo show at the Baum School of Art in Allentown.
Yeah. Oh my God,
gave
that
an
artist talk?
Yeah.
That was unnerving.
I thought you did great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I put on a good game face.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But that was virtually, other than like seeing a piece or two around, that was my introduction to your work. And
Oh, wow,
I
okay.
thought you illuminated it for me.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
I
I
remember
guess you
that
never
talk.
know, right?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. You always, you look at yourself and you never really, I don't know, you never really see yourself the way other people see you, if that makes sense. So it's the same thing when it comes to talking about your work.
I'd prepared a question about what your least favorite part of it all was for you, of your process I was going to target, but I want to know, as an art maker, is that kind of your least favorite part of the whole cycle, talking about it?
Yeah. I think that is the least favorite aspect of that whole thing, is knowing that, at some point you're going to have to talk about your work, or you're going to have to write about your work.
Sure.
And so just to take a step back. So I think in some ways, what I have learned over the years as a means of sort of escaping that kind of torturous thing, I've gotten to enjoy talking about the process of making my work, right? Because I think, earlier, like I don't have some sort of like special message that I'm trying to convey. I don't have this like deep-seated thing going on, right? And so talking about the process, talking about the materials, the objects, the elements, that makes it, when I focus on that, even in something like my artist statement, for example, that makes it much easier to write about it and talk about it. So if you ever look at any of my artist statements over the years, and they've all evolved, they always talk about the process. Mm-hmm. It's just, it just makes it that much easier to discuss.
Yeah.
I think that a person can sense that that's your passion point there when you talk about that, and because it becomes very relatable, but also because when you focus on process, your work has so many materials that are recognizable immediately, that someone may have held at some point. So it's just an inroad to your work. And of course, I think that there is a lot of theory someone could map onto your work. I think it's rich work, but your work doesn't rely on the textuality either. So I think that you're making work that suits your mindset towards talking about it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, Dom, if people want to see your work, check you out, follow you online, where can they do that at?
So you can just search for my name, Domenick Naccarato, DomenickNaccarato.com, my website, and then that's my Instagram handle as well. I post most of my most recent stuff directly on my Instagram feeds. And I'm currently exhibiting at Bethlehem Rotunda Gallery. I'm in a curated show there. That's up until, I think, the first week of November. And then I think I already mentioned it, but I'm at Cocktails and Collecting coming up next month as well at Allentown Art Museum.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Good luck with that. And I'm so excited to go see the Rotunda show. That looks like a great show.
Yeah, it was a good show. Yeah, it was cool over there.
Well, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for having me. This has been awesome, guys.
Thanks, Dom.
Awesome. Take care.
Don't miss the Allentown Art Museum's popular Cocktails and Collecting event, which this year has expanded to 2 days so that everyone gets a chance to participate. On Saturday night, November 6th, from 6 to 9 p.m., you can eat, drink, and be seen at the museum's major fall fundraising party, where 25 regional artists are on hand to talk about and sell their work, from painters and printmakers to fashion designers and sculptors. It's a night out in Allentown's downtown arts district that's unlike any other. Or stop by Sunday, November 7th from 11 to 4 to meet the artists, listen to the sounds of DJ Brad Scott, browse original works of art, and wander the galleries, all free. Details at allentownartmuseum.org.
Thanks for tuning in to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast, a Steel Pixel original series. Don't forget to like the podcast, leave us a review, and follow us on both social media and streaming services at Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast.